squadron commanders, they said, hey, can we risk manage this? How can you risk manage the effects of hypoxia in any aircraft? How do you do it? What do you do? Hey?
Don't go where you require pressure on there.
Yeah, one way of doing it. What else could you do? When does hypoxia become an issue? Above 10,000 feet. So what could you do to minimise the risk?
Fly below 10.
Fly below 10,000 feet. What could you do to minimise the risk if you had to fly above 10,000 feet? Minimise your time in those bands. They've already got oxygen. But yeah, that's spot on. So they said, hey, look, let's minimise our time above flight level 180. Let's minimise our time doing BFM above flight level 200. And let's try and confine some of our general operations to the lower altitudes where we can. Guess what? It worked. Anyway, one of the guys is out doing some combat manoeuvring between 10,000 and flight level 200. And he's flying along and he's pulling G, and he noticed that as he was pulling G on his upper garment of his pressure suit, the hose was crimping as he was pulling G. And he did a few more turns, and he noticed that, yeah, the hose is crimping, and the crimping was staying in the hose through the pressure garment. So it had nothing to do with the manufacture of the aircraft, the oxy system, the mask, the low pressure valves, high pressure valves, or anything like that. It was just pretty much a faulty LC fitment of the hoses through the pressure suit that was made by two different manufacturers that, caused a problem with the issue. So if it hadn't, I suppose the takeaway is, if it hadn't have been for, the culture of, I won't say getting things done, but, the leadership at the squadron level, that identity about staying together as a group and working through a problem, then they wouldn't have been back in the air flying. The aircraft would have been, turfed off as a piece of junk, complete waste of money, and it would probably still be grounded to this day. So that's the F-22 story. I've got one other story to tell you guys about. Cool. The second story I want to talk about is the idea of unit identity.
Just going to add this one before we start.
The idea of unit identity and where it comes from. So I spoke before about US Air Force being stovepiped into the different streams. You've got your fighters, you've got your staff, you've got your, we're moving into the latter part of the 20th century now, you've got your log, you've got your missile dudes. It's the height of the Cold War. The nuclear missile wing was raised in the late 50s and carried on through, being continuously funded more and more and more as they went into the Cold War through the 70s and then into the height of the Cold War in the mid-80s. So if you were in US Air Force and you're a part of the Strategic Missile Command, it was seen as a pretty sweet gig. How do you think that culture went when they got to the 90s, the Berlin Wall came down, and suddenly the Cold War, the threat of nuclear Armageddon became potentially a non-event? How do you think morale went and identity went in that sense? Crashed. Yeah, it crashed massively. So have we been through something recently where we've had our identity changed? We've had our unit emblems, logos, and call signs change? Is that not an important part of what we consider as culture? It is. Well, I think it is anyway, according to groups. But what they found was that these strategic nuclear missile command units were getting very bored. And the quote was from one of the senior battalion commanders, "We're having trouble believing that we will ever actually be employed in role." Now, I've heard people actually say that to me about the domestic CT role. I'm having trouble ever believing that I will be employed in role. And that's a really difficult thing for a commander to deal with, because if you have someone doing a job and they don't believe in the ethos and the origins and the mission, then they should probably move to another role or another unit. Anyway, so as we got into the latter part of the 1990s, the battalions are starting to look like a place that is not really nice to get posted to. In fact, it's a really, really bad place to get posted to. In the early 2000s, the US Air Force opened up Space Command. That was a new thing. It was highly funded, and the senior officers and high-performing officers were leaving Missile Command in droves. So in the late 2000s, 2009, there was a massive incident of use of synthetic marijuana amongst the soldiers of the missile command. They were bored. They had no mission or no role that they believed in. The unit identity and culture was shot. So why not just sit around and smoke some legal, at the time in the States, in certain states they were using it, synthetic marijuana when you're off duty. So needless to say, the culture bombed. So how do you think they entice soldiers and officers to stay in these missile batteries? Because the US Air Force wants to maintain this nuclear strategic strike capability. How do you think they entice them to stay? Money. Yeah. Throw a bit of money at the problem. Always works. Do you think it works? No, it didn't work. It didn't work at all. So one of the things that they've understood and they're trying to, reintroduce is some of the squadron logos, call signs, ethos, culture, uniforms, badges and medals that were in these units previous to the units being changed and modernised, and get them back to their roots for being a strategic strike asset that they had back in the 70s and 80s. And that actually is working to this day. So in summary, I suppose for the chapter that I looked at, solving problems and fixing things in units is sometimes about something that you can't measure, which is culture. And culture comes down to the people in the circle here and how we all feel about what we're doing at work. Money doesn't solve that problem. People do. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Rizzo. Guys, the other chapter we had a quick look at is chapter 10, which was we talked about it briefly before, but Army or the military as a profession. And I think, a lot of the points you talk to, mate, are very relevant there. So, what is a profession? I mean, I've got a couple of definitions here which we'll go through shortly. But how would you define what a profession is?
To be a specialised role or a specialised set of skills that you learn, and I guess you practice those for, at the end of the day, for monetary gain, because you get paid for it.
Yeah. So that's pretty close to the Merriam-Webster's online definition of it, which is participating for gain or livelihood in an activity or field of endeavour often engaged in by entities. Now, I don't know what you guys think about that, but I think that's a fairly generous description of what a profession is. I mean, who would you consider? What industries or what groups spring to mind when I ask you, hey, what's a professional? Woody, what?
Doctors.
Yep, doctors, perfect. Lawyers, reading.
Engineering.
Yeah. So of all those things, do you think there's many amateur doctors who do it on the weekend without qualifications and pay? I mean, there's probably a few, but not ones that are above the detection threshold. So that's a fairly, I'd say broad description. But this article or this chapter is really about, was written on the basis of the US Army and how they've struggled with this question of, is the military a profession, and if it is, how do we harness that, how do we develop the culture as a profession. So they've done quite a lot of work, and they've got units and cells and training commands essentially dedicated to this question and the development of a professional officer and soldier culture within their army. And they've come up with a definition which I actually think is probably reasonably good for a military definition, and I'll read it to you now, and I'll just be interested in your thoughts on the back end of it. So the Army profession. A profession has 5 dimensions or aspects. 1, the profession provides a unique and vital service to the society they serve. One society cannot provide itself. Now apply that metric to all those groups you just talked about. So doctors, right? Society can't provide medical treatment to itself. Lawyers, same kind of deal, right? There's no, you probably shouldn't be doing it on your own on the weekend. You'll get yourself in trouble. So I think that fits that description reasonably well. 2, professions provide the service by applying expert knowledge and practice. I'd say that's fairly uncontroversial. I think that fits most of those descriptions as well, generally. 3, and I think this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced. Professions can earn the trust of the society because of effective and ethical application of their expertise. So, what do you guys reckon about that one? Take an engineer. Is it about his skill or is it about his ethics associated with his engineering?
Yeah, skill.
What do you think there?
Skills.
Yeah, so maybe there's a little bit more to it. That's a fairly, I think, a specific definition that might not provide a coverall for all professions. But in the military context, I think that probably fits how we would see ourselves. Does anyone disagree with that?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the engineering piece, you look at how they've got their cladding on the outside of the buildings, which is highly flammable. So people live in these buildings, they drive over the bridges, and they've got a lot of trust that the engineers didn't just take the money and run and just have a really crap plan. And then I guess when you come to a military application and you're talking about having, I guess, the ethics overlay on top, it could be viewed that we use the banner of a profession at arms to give you that moral high ground so that you can go forward and you can conduct, I guess, lethal activities because you've got that moral banner and you've got the moral high ground. And I guess that's the way that you justify it because you are a profession at arms. It's another layer to that justification for what we do.
Yeah, and I think this next point speaks exactly to what you've been talking about there. So the 4th aspect that they define that makes up the profession of arms, or a profession, is professions self-regulate and police the practices of their members to assure is effective and ethical. This self-regulation includes the responsibility for educating and certifying professionals. So self-regulation, different professions have different outputs. Ultimately, ours is the delivery of an effect in defence of the national security of this country. But we also have a responsibility to self-regulate that because there's no peer organisation within Australia who sits next to defence and can look in and say, well, we don't do it this way, we do it differently, so there can be cross-regulation. Essentially, we are the experts of what we do, there's no one else. So give me some examples of how you see us self-regulating internally. Jimmy?
I'd say AARs are a pretty good way to do that. Yeah, that's probably the main thing.
I think the way that we do it is we compare ourselves to coalition partners when we exercise together.
Yep.
So I think that's the key one, and we can see how they're doing business, and they can also see how we're doing business. And at the end of it, AAR join together, share points, and learn something from it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's excellent. Obviously, we do a plethora of introspection after any kind of event we do or any kind of operation, which I guess talks to the positive side of self-regulation, being the, hey, how do we make ourselves better? But there's a negative side to it as well, right? If we identify someone within the ranks who is not meeting the standards or not performing their duties, we have mechanisms to self-regulate in that instance as well. You guys over the back there, got any? What do you think? Where do you think that sits? And how do you think we do that?
So we basically build, in our in aviation, we build standards. So in all of our courses, there's essentially a pass mark, and then we can grade above that pass mark as well to show how well someone's performing overall. And yeah, that allows us, if somebody's not meeting the benchmark, we can remove them from the training or the activity, and that ensures we maintain a certain standard as to what we believe is required to perform our role.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dali, do you think the DFDA is a means of self-regulation?
It is a means of self-regulation. Whether it is the correct means or whether it works effectively in our role is probably up for different debate. But yeah, it's seen by Army as a means of self-regulation.
Yeah, and I think, we are unique as an organisation within Australia who has a legislative ability to punish our members if they don't meet our cultural standards. And if you're working for KPMG down the street as a lawyer, they can fire you, or you can be pulled in front of an ethics committee, but you can't be sent to jail without going to court. We can do that to our members, which is a significant power that we hold, and it's a self-regulating power at its base. The final point they use to describe a profession is professions are therefore granted significant autonomy and discretion in their practice of expertise on behalf of the society. And I think we talked about that before with lethal effects, right? Nobody else really does lethal effects on behalf of government other than us. So that autonomy is something that we need to maintain. But the reality is, if we don't hold our professional ethic to a high standard, we aren't regarded as a profession, then we will be externally regulated, and there will be external entities that come in to control the organisation and continue to control the organisation, which makes it more and more difficult for us to deliver our actual job, which ultimately is, among other things, lethal effects. Okay. So it's a bit of a longer definition than the Webster's online dictionary definition, but I think it probably fits a little bit better, and you can see there's been a clear amount of work that's gone into that over time. The next point it makes, and it goes in and talks a lot about how the American Army and the American military is established under the Constitution and how it's mandated and legislated for in American society. Now that's not very different to how we exist in Australian society either. But there's acts of parliament that have, and the Defence Act is the overarching one that says, hey, as a society, we need a military. The military exists within the society, but it is separate, and we give it these powers to self-regulate itself. Not that different from the American model, but it's got an interesting a sentence here which I'll read to you. It says, as a profession, the military serves under the trust of the American population, and trust I think is key, through elected officials as directed by law to accomplish the nation's strategic objectives. Every failure of personnel and the institutions to uphold the standards of conduct not only undermine the basis for military professionalism, but also breaks down the relationship of trust between the public and the military. Ultimately, as will be discussed later, this degradation in trust of military institutions leads to increased scrutiny and oversight of the military's ability to self-regulate by the legislature. So I think if you draw that back to the definition, you can see that if we undermine ourselves as a profession or as professionals, it has a fundamental impact on how we can do our jobs or how we can deliver our what government asks of us, because the environment we're operating in significantly changes. Reedy, having said all that, do you sort of see and apply this to the military or the army as it stands today? Do you think there's any events or any significant processes that are going on over the last 5 to 10 years, which speak to this kind of issue within our army?
Not specifically. Can you elaborate more?
Okay, so there's an inquiry going on at the moment into war crimes in Afghanistan. Now, without speaking to guilt or innocence associated with that, but the process in itself, how do you think that affects the military as a profession, but also how external entities may now want to come and regulate inside the military?
Sure. I think there's two sides to it. I think the first side of it that you look at is the effect on the organisation and how insight or essentially Big Brother looking in and reaching down, how that affects the culture and morale of the affected units and the individuals within those units. But there's also the other side of it that as the society to look at the military to be able to see that if the military may or may not have done something wrong and someone puts their hand up and says, hey, I think something may have happened, that there is that check and balance available, that it can be looked at, and that if something hasn't been done in the correct manner, that they would be dealt with, or the organisation would be corrected in the way it's being doing business. So I think if you look at both of those aspects, pros and cons, but I think overall it has to be there. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. You've taken a positive out of the investigation itself. Pat, talking about the positive side of being able to investigate ourselves, or at least self-report to then be externally investigated. Do you want to elaborate any further on that?
To be fair, no, I can't think of anything additional that I can throw on top. I was just thinking at the parallels, I guess, in terms of the self-regulation that needs to happen here, and how that might be applied to the US. So you see how and I don't know what left and right and who's wrong with the US media, but the Black Lives Matter piece in the police, and just how society, and obviously the police is far more actively involved in the society. As soon as you lose that trust in the entity, just how much it can degrade. So I guess it's really great to see that we are on the front foot of that. And you can already see some changes that are happening that are pretty positive prior to those results being delivered from the inquiry. So yeah, definitely something that you want to self-regulate before someone has to step in and do it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with those definitions we talked about before, that self-regulation piece is a key to what a profession is. So, guys, I think that probably covers that chapter and what a profession is and how we as the military can either build the professional basis of what we do or how we can undermine it by, and I think you used the word trust before, Matt. I think that really is the crux of this. It's trust both within the organisation, but it's also that trust relationship between us, the government and wider society, which is, as we all know, takes a very long time to build, but can be undermined very easily. So guys, thank you very much for coming out to this conversation. But I think unless anyone else has got any more points, we might leave it there.